The practical and doctrinal rather, should come forward and say, okay, why is Pope Francis saying these things? Why is he using this term inadmissible? Because really, Pope Francis is the one who is, whether you want to say it's ambiguous or intentional, I think it's intentional. I'll present why. It is a rupture with tradition. It is a rupture with the faith. And going to something you said, when it comes to, quote, new doctrine, the Catholic Church cannot create new doctrine. We have a deposit of faith given to us by our Lord, and that deposit of faith may be explicit truths or implicit truths. Those explicit truths are going to become more and more clear, and those implicit truths are going to become more and more clear. So we're not just going to make a 110% reversal. I mean, I don't know if you've kept up with this, Jordan, but like, it's so interesting now to see cardinals and bishops saying, especially with this really, really evil synodal way, saying there's a potential legit schism that's about to happen inside of the church.
I think it already has softly been happening for a hot second. It's been happening for a very hot second, and now it's louder, and it's unfortunate. And I keep telling friends and coworkers and everything. I say you have to prepare for the day where you are no longer called a Catholic in good standing. I already am not, because of my position, according to some bishops, on the society, or my opinions on Latin Mass or Pope Francis or something. But you just have to be prepared one day to be called genuinely schismatic, because it's one of those lovely Catholic buzzwords that we love so much. But this might actually be a serious case, right? This for me is La Salette playing itself out.
Yeah, and you even just mentioning the Latin Mass, happy anniversary of Traditionis Custodes.
Which also is on the feast day of Our Lady Mount Carmel, which was a double gut. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm thinking back now. This is we were speaking exactly 2 years ago on this night. On this night when this came out, freaking out about this. I posted today on Facebook. I was like, I'm going to go celebrate Traditionis Custodes by going to the Latin Mass.
So I saw,
because that's what you just got to do. But yeah, how do we respond to this? I mean, so let's put it this way: is Pope Francis going too far? Are we just misunderstanding him? It goes back down to this idea of what does inadmissible mean, because that's not a word you really hear very often. I've heard a lot of people mean that what that means is it's not immoral in and of itself, but it should never happen. Okay, there's like some philosophical problems with that, because it's like, okay, what do you mean it should never happen?
It doesn't pop usually up in church documents, that word, if I remember correctly.
I don't think so either. Yeah, it's definitely one of those weird kind of loosey-goosey words. Now, here's why I think, first and foremost, why he uses a loosey-goosey word. I think he uses a loosey-goosey word because he wants to soften the blow. Because when you read the interviews he has on this subject, not the church documents, but the interviews he has on it, he's very explicit that before Vatican II, we did things this way. Yep. Post Vatican II, we are now enlightened, and we should now just kind of get rid of this for forever. Yep. And so you have to take those into account of how you're interpreting some of these documents. It's like, okay, well, how does the guy who wrote it interpret it? Well, look at the rest of what he says. And so therefore, I think when you see him saying, like, let's get rid of this period, the church has changed her thought on this, that cannot happen. Whether whether it's poor seminary training on his part, whether it's maliciousness on his part, I don't want to, say that that's what it is. But the reality is, whatever it is against church teaching. And it is something that at the end of the day needs to be reversed.
Yeah, this is the fact that this, again, is coming out of the papal office. As with everything and confusing these days, and quite deliberately so, I think you and I are both on the same boat. I don't think it's even controversial remotely to say such things anymore. The Holy Father says this, right? St. John Paul II clearly and firmly stated clearly and firmly that the death penalty is inadequate from a moral standpoint and no longer necessary from that of penal justice. I'll get to that in a second. There can be no stepping back from this position. Today, we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible, and the church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. So I love the phrase, like, stepping back from this position. And what I've always said with people who like to rah sis boom bah Pope Francis is that if you point to the authority of, say, a papal encyclical written by your favorite pope and say, see, now we can't go back. He did that with Summorum Pontificum and Benedict. So what is to stop the next guy? See, this is why I don't like this pendulum papacies that we're living in. What is to stop the next guy from coming over and being like, hey, the papal encyclical your guy wrote, it's now inadmissible. Pope John Paul II in 1995 in Evangelium Vitae said it was condemned except in cases of absolute necessity would it not be possible to defend society. But he then says something really weird, right? Which is are very rare, if not practically non-existent. And I think about that phrase, the protection of society, essentially, because part of the issue that you have is, okay, maybe on an individual level, if you lock up a murderer for life, he's not going to get out and commit more murders. Okay. Mm-hmm. But the question is, how does that change the psychology of how a society ought to look at crime and punishment? If I say I could kill, because the problem that we humans have, of course, is that even though God, of course, judges us perfectly in all cases, especially in the next world, we have to get a semblance of God's justice here on earth, right, as best as possible. This is why God, even again from the Old Testament, actually gives the law to humans, to Moses, right, to Abraham, fulfilled through Christ, all of these sorts of things. Because we have to have a semblance of God's justice here on earth. It's not enough for Catholics just to go, oh, well, we'll just, it's true. God ultimately will determine if one was a wicked man or a good man. Of course he will. But we see that here on earth. And so I think about Trent, right? Because when this first happened in 2020, I went to Trent because Trent is so easy to read. Mm-hmm. Trent is, I know all trads have to have this obligation to love Trent, but just as it's written, and why it's written, it is a great counsel. They were batting 10 out of 10. So in Trent 1566 here, far from being guilty of breaking this commandment, thou shalt not kill, such an execution of justice is precisely an act of obedience to it. For the purpose of the law is to protect and foster human life. This purpose is fulfilled when the legitimate authority of the state is exercised by taking the guilty lives of those who have taken innocent lives. Okay, so there's you're keeping in church tradition. It doesn't mean that the state has to enforce it. I said a little bit because I made a community post prefacing this episode, but I said I'm totally fine with the state saying something like this: we have the authority given by God, since all power comes from God, to exercise the death penalty for those most heinous of crimes. However, maybe it's motivation by magnanimity, right? Not by immorality, that we choose instead to do a different way. But that doesn't mean that you're removed, right? Your crime is fitting of your punishment, but we are determining a different way. That for me is a very different sort of way than now trying to say, well, the death penalty is inadmissible. The church fights for its abolition, which implies, again, if you're a Catholic who says, I can still object to such a thing, it implies that you're being a bad Catholic. You are not practicing your faith as supposed to be passed down by the bride of Christ.